where people can take an honest look at issues and then bring those issues into concert with these other aspects of their life. And yeah, I mean, just today I made a post on LinkedIn and on my Facebook authors page about an article that I co-wrote with a student who took my very first animal ethics class 20 years ago. Her name is Sarah Bodbile Rules, and she is now the Associate Dean for Graduate Research at the Van Andel Institute in Grand Rapids. So now very much my peer, and if titles are concerned, my superior, right? She's an Associate Dean.
You're listening to the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show. I'm your host, Kathleen Gage. We're here to plant seeds on compassion to animals, your health, and the environment, and topics related to business that align with all three of those areas. Enjoy the show. Well, today I am kind of taking a detour from the usual, let's talk about cooking plant-based, because in the most recent episode, we had Kathy Hester, who is a plant-based chef. And today I am talking to a professor of philosophy, Matt Halteman, and Matt has written several books, and the most recent book that he wrote is Hungry, Beautiful Animals, The Joyful Case for Going Vegan, which I love that title. And I, as I've been doing my vegan journey since 2018, at first I didn't call myself a vegan. I didn't want to be a crazy vegan. And then after about 6 months, I realized I'm a crazy vegan because it really is about the animals. And that's what I'd love to get into today. So Matt, great to have you here.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Kathleen. And I really appreciate your courage in asking a philosophy professor onto your show. We have a way of making human beings scatter like roaches from a tactical flashlight at parties. We're not always the world's most popular. So I will do my very best to be at my winsome utmost today for your show, and I beg your audience's forgiveness in advance for any infelicitous philosophy professor moments.
Okay, well, we're going to have to dummy it down a little bit. Okay, but quite seriously, you can talk about whatever you want to, because like I said, the further I go into being a vegan, the more horrendous the truth becomes. And my whole reason for having this podcast show is to shine that spotlight on the roaches who consume animal products. I mean, I just, the more information we have, it just boggles my mind how people who can say they love animals and they have pets and they take really good care of their pets, and then they go and they have a chicken meal or a steak or whatever it may be. So I want to dig deep, and I want you to go wherever you want to go with this. But let's start with, when did you become vegan and why did you become vegan?
Yeah, so I went vegan in late 2004, early 2005. So I'm celebrating my 20th anniversary. Good time to bring a book out on these topics. And I'm a pretty tough nut to crack. I mean, I'm a philosophy professor, so I have, a lot of good argumentative excuses for avoiding realizations I don't like, and, pretty good on my feet when it comes to the arguments. And so it took a whole bunch of different things coming together in my life simultaneously. And I'll start a little bit farther back. So I grew up in the American Midwest. I come from agriculture on both sides of my family. So, very much a meat eater growing up, loved the stuff, and I got to be 30 years old without having any real idea, despite being a philosophy professor, someone who is supposedly living the examined life, right? And here's this huge part of my everyday experience that I have never once thought about in relation to any of the values or spiritual principles, right, that motivate my life. So in my 30th year, three things kind of came together at once. And, one of the things that I really try to hammer home in my book is that we human beings are really complicated creatures when it comes to our agency, right? So we're physical organisms to start, and we have emotional lives, and we have social lives, and we have intellectual lives and moral lives. And I don't know if you're like me, Kathleen, but I sometimes find that those different parts of who I am aren't always in perfect agreement, right? That I emotionally I feel one way, but I know intellectually that the arguments kind of cut in a different direction.
Hmm.
Socially, maybe my friends have a different opinion than I do. Physically, I have the cravings, especially around food. So it took three of those aspects of who I am kind of getting walloped at the same time. And the first one was the emotional wallop. And that, I know this is kind of a boring origin story, but it was my dog Gus, my bulldog Gus. My wife is a dog person. I grew up with kind of aloof cats that kind of lived half on the street, half in our house. I had never really met another animal, as a unique, irreplaceable individual until Susan was like, okay, when we move out of grad student housing and we get our own house and we can have a dog, we're getting one. And I don't care who, because I love them all. But since you're the persnickety one who thinks you're allergic to dogs, you can choose the breed. So I chose this bulldog, not knowing at the time, right, that the selective breeding around bulldogs is another terrible
Right.
story in itself. This is a part of my learning journey. But Gus was the first time I ever saw, beyond a shadow of a doubt, holy smokes, this is a person. Not a human person, right? I'm not a fool, but a
Hmm.
canine person,
Hmm.
someone who has likes and dislikes, somebody who enjoys spending time with certain people and really doesn't trust other people, somebody who loves to have his belly rubbed and hates to have his ear scratched. I mean, just very, very different, right? In all of these proclivities and interests. And so Gus really got me thinking, well, geez, this is something new. I've never experienced an animal as a unique individual. And at round about the same time, a fellow philosopher friend of mine, we were having lunch at a conference, and he says to me, aren't you a pacifist? And I was like, yeah. And he said, well, you're eating a French dip sandwich there. Is that really a good fit with your pacifism? And I thought, what? Like, what? I don't even know what you're talking about here. Like, what's the link between the food and the pacifism? It just is not something I had spent a lot of time thinking about. And so he kind of dared me. With philosophers, all we have is our authenticity, right? We don't have
Hmm.
prestige, we don't have money, we don't have fame, but we do stand up in front of people and say, live the examined life, be the change you want to see in the world, strive for that personal authenticity. And so these were fighting words from a philosopher, right? Like, you better investigate your food choices. And when you do, maybe you'll see, right, things a little differently. So that was kind of the intellectual hit. And then the third one, which was one of the most important, was kind of the social comfort piece. And my wife, Susan, is a culinary wizard, right? She's one of those people who can pull together three ingredients into something that tastes like a Michelin star restaurant, amazing chef. And so when I said, oh gosh, I feel like the combination of Gus and this intellectual challenge, maybe we should, eat a little differently. I decided to teach this class. And she's like, well, you know what we should do? While you're teaching the class, we should err on the side of being too conservative and we should go vegan. And I was like, no, let's not do that. Please, let's not do that. Let's get the compassionate pork roast for $16.99 a pound, from the farm down the road. And, Susan, I'll just be honest, she's the moral spine of our relationship. So she was kind of stood firm and she's like, I love a challenge in the kitchen and this is going to be fun. And I was like, this is not going to be fun. But not only was it fun, it was mind blowing. I mean, I discovered that there's so much more diversity and sort of culinary uh, excitement when you move away from like the hockey puck sized piece of meat, the overcooked vegetable, and the starch, right, with a ton of salt and sauce. And like that had kind of been the world I was used to. And so
Hmm.
when I went into this abundance of plant-based food, thanks to Susan's, social courage, that really provided that last piece that, oh my gosh, I can do this. And not only can I be comfortable, it's going to be this explosion of exciting new possibilities. And so that combination of Gus with the emotional hit, my fellow philosopher Nathan Nobis with the intellectual challenge, and then Susan showing me socially, hey, we can do this. That's how it all got started for me.
That's pretty amazing. Now, is Nathan vegan?
Nathan is vegan. Yep.
Okay, okay.
And he is
we
also
owe,
a philosophy
yeah,
professor. So
we
yeah.
definitely owe Nathan a debt of gratitude because for him to have the courage to put that challenge out to you. And it's amazing how many people see something in the people they care about and they love, but they're afraid to say anything because they don't want to rock the boat. And reality is we've got to rock the boat. So good on Nathan. And now I take it you and your wife have been married longer than 20 years.
Yep. We've been together almost 26, coming up
Okay.
on, yeah. So a
Excellent,
long
excellent.
time since
And
1998.
it's pretty amazing that the two of you went vegan together because oftentimes it's one person. In my household, I'm vegan, my wife is not, and we've been together
hmm
35 years. And
Wow.
with that, we've had to set boundaries and just say, okay, this is acceptable, this is not. And one of the things that I drew a line on is I do most of the grocery shopping and I do most of the cooking. I will not cook any animal-based products and I don't buy her meat or dairy. It's
hmm
just like, okay, those are the guidelines. And we had to have discussions around that. So
Mm.
it's kind of a jump for you to go 20 years ago from becoming vegan and then writing this book on the 20th anniversary, Hungry, Beautiful Animals, The Joyful Case for Going Vegan. Now, in the press release, you mentioned that being vegan is often viewed worse than being an atheist, which, we all have our opinion. Is that good or bad being an atheist? I don't know. We won't get into that one here, but
I know a lot of terrific atheists.
I do too.
I've
I
learned a
might
lot
sometimes
from
look
them.
at one in the mirror. But and then we have the whole thing that it's almost as bad as being a drug addict. I'm 41 years in recovery, so hey, that's not such a bad thing. So I'm checking off all the boxes there. But how did you go from deciding to be vegan and really looking at the whole philosophical view around that and the spiritual view to writing this book? Because I know you've written some other books too.
Yeah. So I guess you know how it is when you get a little bit older and hopefully a little bit wiser, you kind of look back over the work you've done and you say, you know, I'm glad to have done this work, but there's some things left undone,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd really like to try to do some of those things on the life list that I haven't gotten around to yet. And one of the things that's really important to me in my classroom is to teach courses that meet students where they are on the ground of their lived experiential world, right? So I think sometimes philosophy can be very abstract, right? You ask questions like, are there tables and chairs or is it just particles arranged table wise? I mean, really, really, right? Abstract, 60,000 feet. And I found over the years, those are interesting questions. It's fun to think about some of that stuff, but not most students aren't going to go on to be philosophy majors. And so the challenge that I've always loved in the classroom is how do I make philosophy the lived pursuit of wisdom, the love of wisdom in our daily affairs into something transformational for my students, right? Something that they'll go in with one view of themselves and come out, right, with this expanded view of themselves and the world around them. And most importantly, how they can contribute to the truth, beauty, and goodness of the world around them. And so food ethics quickly showed itself as an incredible way both to get people thinking about the most abstract topics you can imagine, right? What is a human being? What is an animal? Why do we think there are these huge differences, even though there are all these biological similarities? Why do religions tend to look at animals this way and human beings this other way, right? So super abstract questions there, but also incredibly concrete questions, right? Like what constitutes nutritional health, right? And how do we eat in a way that unifies these different parts of who we are? And eating obviously is something that we do. I mean, I used to say 3 times a day, but let's be honest, 6, 7, 8 times a day, right? We love to eat. We human
Right.
beings, eating is everything, as Mark Bittman, often says, and it's woven into our relationships and our self-understanding and the way we perform gender and class and all the rest. And so I really wanted food ethics over the years has become this mainstay of my teaching because students find it so intriguing and it gives them something to take with them when they go out there into the world, something that not only helps them to bring together these different parts of their inner selves, right? Because often they find when they study food ethics, gosh, you know, my emotional life and my intellectual life are way out of whack.
Hmm.
I love dogs, but I have these intellectual commitments that make it seem like it's okay to kill cows for no good reason and eat them for pleasure. That doesn't really fit. Or their social life and their intellectual life is different, right? Intellectually, they've come to see that the arguments for going vegan are ironclad, but emotionally and socially, they can't face it at the moment, right? Because it's too hard to give up the products they love, or their friend groups are too dyed in the wool with the animal eating that it's hard for them to imagine making a break. So animal ethics helps them to kind of unify those different parts of
Hmm.
who they are on the
Hmm.
inside, but it also gives them tools to go out into the world and start making a difference, right? As consumers, as educators, as advocates for the welfare and rights of members of other species, worker justice, right? Climate issues. As you know, I'm a listener, to the various other podcasts you've done. And, this is connected to every link in the great chain of being, right? There is nothing that isn't affected by our food system, from the people who raise the food to the climate issues to the environmental impact of all this resource use to the way we treat arable land and lose our topsoil, right? I mean, our world is affected at every level
Right.
by these decisions. And so, after teaching this for all these years, I started to realize, well, gosh, in my classroom, I've done a reasonably good job of bringing this down to earth for people. But in my scholarly life, I've mostly written articles that maybe 8 to 20 people will read, right? Including pity reads from my mom and sister, maybe. My sister's also a philosophy professor. So, I get one extra read than most philosophers. Um, and so I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool to try to take these 20 years of learnings with all these wonderful students that I've had and try to make it available to everybody in language that will not presume any kind of expertise or even
Hmm.
interest, right? I wanted to write a book that wouldn't preach to the choir, but would meet every person where they are and say, hey, here is an intro, an invitation to a path that will create abundant joy in your life, not an obligation that will loom and make you feel excluded and sad and judged and on the outs with your friends and family, but a decision that will actually put in front of you opportunities for flourishing that you've scarcely imagined
Right.
previously, right? You'll
Right.
no more, or vastly reduced physical inflammation. Finally, emotional coherence between how you feel about your dog and how you treat the animals who usually come to our plate, right? Intellectual commitments to what's fair, right? When it comes to how sentient creatures should be treated, a social commitment to making the world a better place for the workers who are asked to do these horrible things, repeatedly ignoring the cries of creatures who don't want to die, right? In all these ways, we knit our inner selves together in ways that can collectively change the world, on a grand scale. And I
Right.
thought that would be a really beautiful thing to write a book about, instead of talking about what vegans are against, all of the false and ugly, right, and bad things that we'd like to close the slam the door on, right? What if we talked less about those and focused more on the things we're for, right? Which is honesty and truth and a
Hmm.
beautiful world and the goodness of a life well lived with intellectual and emotional and social and physical, right, flourishing and coherence. So that
Uh,
was the idea.
and I love what you're saying, and I have to say that lately, with what happened with United Healthcare, the CEO, that's given pause for a lot of conversation around our healthcare system. And then you look at how big pharma is connected with that in the food industry, and tragic situation. And that's not the point of this discussion, but it does bring up us taking more responsibility for our own health, and that good health is a beautiful thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think if nothing else, one of the most important conversations people need to have is that right now we are a victim to the healthcare system. There is no two ways about it. We don't have to be. We don't have to create victims out of the animals. We don't have to create victims out of ourselves or the environment. And it's so interesting because you have the Hungry Beautiful Animals. Now, where did you get that title, Hungry Beautiful Animals, and the joyful case for going vegan? I get that
Yeah.
part, but where did
Yeah.
Hungry Beautiful Animals come from?
Yeah. So this is probably me trying to be too much of a philosopher, but I think it's pretty
Well, that's
straightforward.
that's
Yeah.
who you are.
Yeah, it
It's like,
is. It
hey.
is. So I guess what I was thinking, I'm always trying to think about ways to minimize the moral differences between human beings and members of other species
Mhm.
while retaining the really important differences, right? Because we're both the same in many ways and vastly different in many ways. And I think sometimes we don't get that balance right, when we're trying to think about these things. And so, Hungry Beautiful Animals is a way of describing what all sentient creatures in the world have in common. So we're hungry. And what that means is we have desires, right? And these desires, they push us forward into the world. If we didn't have these desires, we'd never last, right? And it's thanks to these desires that we can move ahead, right, with our life projects. At the same time, we're all animals. We're biological organisms, right? And we're creatures that have really significant animal limits, right? We have physical bodies. There are limitations to what we can know and understand. There are things that our perceptions enable us to do and things that we're not able to do, given the limits of our bodies. And so there's this sense in which our hunger, our desires, and our animal limits are kind of coming into conflict, right? I mean, we've all had that experience of really, really wanting something. And then our animal nature says, nope, right? Like you can't get everything you want. There's these bodily limits, there's these intellectual limits, there's these social limits. And so the idea is that our beauty hangs in the balance between these desires that push us forward into the world and these animal limits that push back. And what it means to flourish, to live our most beautiful life, is to get those desires and those animal limits into balance with each other, right? And that's something that I think other animals do a lot better than human beings, right? Other animals kind of do a much better job of having their desires and their animal limits right in place. Human animals, I think, have we our desires often vastly overreach our reasonable limits, and that's how we get into these circumstances where we take other people's bodies to eat them, right? And we take other people's land and use it, right? I mean, we have this tendency to we never stop quite soon enough, right? Those desires push us too far in the direction of excess, and then those excesses have a way of destroying not only the others, right, that we're messing with, but also doubles back and hurts us, right? And I think that the food system and the healthcare system, right, classic examples of this, where
Right.
we haven't lived within our limitations. We've wanted too much, and as a result of that, we're not experiencing the flourishing, right, that we could be experiencing if we manage to get our desires and our limitations more in concert. So Hungry Beautiful Animals is an effort to say our beauty, our flourishing hangs in the balance between these desires that push us forward into the world and these animal limitations that push back. Let's find our beauty in the balance of those parts of who we are.
You know, in a perfect world, we would achieve that. And I have to wonder, will we ever? But before we do, I want to remind people that you are listening to the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show. I'm your host, Kathleen Gage, and I'm talking with Matt Halteman, who is the author of Hungry Beautiful Animals, The Joyful Case for Going Vegan. He is a vegan. He's a philosopher. He's a husband. And he is a man who is on a mission to help educate people. Now, you mentioned about how your dog was kind of the catalyst for some of this. And I have to tell you, a few years ago, my wife and I, we do a lot of animal rescue. Right now, we have 3 horses, we have chickens, we have a rooster, we have dogs, we have a cat that went over the Rainbow Bridge recently, and 99.9% of them are rescue animals. And it was one of our little rescues that showed up on our property. We're out in Oregon. And we didn't even know what she was. It turns out she was a toy Shih Tzu. She had been
Oh,
a
wow.
breeder mill dog, a puppy mill dog for about 10 years. She
Mm.
was flat on one side. She could hardly walk. And how she ended up on our property is beyond me. Well, turns out
Lucky her.
yeah, she was very lucky, and so were we. I mean, she really brought light to a lot of things that were really important for me to see in life. And one was I did a crowdfunding to raise some money to do some vet care for her, and the rest I donated to some sanctuaries. But it was interesting because she was the catalyst for me starting to work in the pet industry. At the time, I
Mm.
was doing a lot of keynote speaking. I was a consultant pretty much for a general market. I wasn't focused necessarily on the pet industry. And I certainly wasn't focusing on vegan at the time because I wasn't vegan.
Mhm.
And as a result, a woman who runs a huge conference contacted me and said, "We want you to come out and speak at our conference." And I said, "I'm not in the pet industry. That's not what I do." She goes, "You do digital marketing, so we want you out there." Well, that one opportunity turned into quite a few opportunities, and it was Delaney's story. So we called her Delaney, and she had a story to tell. And it was through her story that a lot of people really became aware about puppy mills and things of that nature. But at the time, I was not vegan, but I still knew there was a disconnect going to a pet conference speaking. I'm on the platform. There's about 600 people in the audience and don't like speaking during meals, but I happen to be speaking during a meal, and they're bringing out fish and they're bringing out chicken and they're bringing out steak. And in my mind, I'm doing my keynote, but I'm thinking something's wrong with this picture. And
Yeah.
and yet I still wasn't vegan at that point. It took a
Yeah.
few more years before I did become vegan. But I found it interesting how a dog was my entree into the pet industry. That was where I really had my first awakening of the cognitive dissonance that many of us go through. So, Matt, with your book, tell us, the 30,000 foot view of what people can expect when they read their book, and what is your favorite chapter? And I guess that's like asking, who's your favorite child? Who's your favorite pet? I don't know.
Yeah. Wow. So I guess the elevator pitch is something like this. It's, everybody knows what vegans are against. We're against the suffering, right? And we're against the exploitation, and we're against the factory farms and the testing on animals. Fewer people know what vegans are for, right? The things that really motivate us to get out of bed in the morning, get out there into the world and live, right? In this way that initially seems very different from the way that other people live. But once you take a closer look under the hood, you see all it means to be going vegan is to be living into those kindergarten ethics we learned when we were knee high to a
Mm,
grasshopper, right? And so, what Hungry Beautiful Animals attempts to do without assuming any fancy philosophical theories, without doing anything that would be alienating, right? Hopefully, to somebody who hasn't devoted their life to philosophy, using mostly a combination of narrative and humor. I want to take people through that journey of realizing there's nothing really all that radical about going vegan. It's just an extension of the values, beliefs, and spiritual and intellectual precepts that they've been learning since they were 6 years old,
right.
right? And I think that framing um, seemed new and refreshing to me, because I think so often we start with these arguments that look really strange to people when you talk about things like animal rights, right? And people are like, "What? What does that mean?" Or when you talk about consequentialism, or what, there's all this sort of fancy terms. And if you're not somebody who spends a lot of time up there at 60,000 feet, you might think, well, I'm not going to read this Peter Singer book, this, Princeton philosopher talking about these things that don't really meet me where I am and have a lot of complex theories. That book actually has helped a ton of people, including me, but it's not for everyone, right? And so, what I wanted to try to do is write a book that anyone who's been around the block once or twice, anyone, right, thinking a little bit about food, could pick up and have a few laughs and get connected to the things they already believe, they already feel, and they already know, and just connect those dots, right? From
Right.
who they already are to who they could be going vegan. And so it's really an effort to, um, help people who are curious about all the hubbub, right? And I think there's a lot of people out there who they've got a friend or a child, right, who's suddenly eating in a different way. And they're like, what? This seems really crazy. This seems really radical. Why would anyone do this? And Hungry Beautiful Animals is an effort really to take people from 0 to 60, right, in a quick read, where they can see sort of what would motivate a person to do this, why it isn't particularly radical, and most important of all, how moving in this direction is actually what I call a joy aggregator, right? It takes all these different places where we find joy in our lives and it harvests it all, right? I mean, from addressing our physical inflammation, as I said before, to our emotional coherence, to our intellectual integrity, to our social awareness, and to worker justice, and to environmental sustainability. It's like all these things that we already care about that we never manage to connect to food.
Right.
Going vegan is this amazing way to get joy in all of those places at once, right? With this very straightforward thing that we all do every day.
Absolutely. And for me, that's how it started, was the inflammation. I actually had inflammation and I decided to do some research. And from what I studied, I found that if I gave up meat and dairy, the inflammation would go away. So I thought, okay, I'll do it for 7 days. I mean, I was not committed at all at that point. It's like 7 days and we'll see if there's a change. Within 2 days, dramatic change. But I did the no SOS also, no sugar, salt, oil. And after a week, it was just like, oh, this is incredible. And I had more energy, more focus. I thought, okay, I'll give it another 7 days. Well, that was for me what it took. The thought of going 100% vegan right away was not even in the conversation, but it started with inflammation. And what I've been amazed at is how many aspects of our life are impacted by either the consumption of or the elimination of meat and dairy and any animal products. And, with what you said, it's for me, I didn't realize that mine would actually go into cosmetics, hair products, all that. And I want to give a shout out to Sally's Beauty products. They have stores all around, and they have cruelty-free products, vegan products. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, because there's so many products that are tested on animals. And one of the things we start doing is going to that next level of, okay, first it's the personal products, then it's the clothing, then it's the shoes, and then it's the accessories that we get. And then, it's like this domino effect. And I recently saw a documentary called Buy Now, the shopping conspiracy. Now, that may not seem like it has anything to do with veganism, and it has everything to do with veganism, because it's about how much consumption we have around products that are made from animal byproducts, and then the waste that these go into landfills. These end up on beaches in third world countries and on the land, and it's just the destruction that we are doing. So to have a positive look, and I saw with some of your endorsements, you had Lisa, who wrote Vegan Ethics. You had Gene Bauer, who is, I'm trying to think what sanctuary he has.
Farm Sanctuary.
Yeah, amazing gentleman, and how it all started for them. And that's the thing about the people that are the voices for the voiceless, and they have a spotlight on them for being vegan. We all started by just making a decision not to eat meat for today. That was how it started for most people. But I'm curious, in your with your students, how many of your students have actually decided to go vegan as a result of what they learned from you?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, one of the things that philosophy professors are pretty concerned about, we focus on teaching people how to think and live more than teaching them what to think or do, right? And so it's pretty important to me as a professor not to bring personal leverage, right, as the professor, for here's how you ought to think or here's how you ought to live. And so my approach is not what I would call vegangelical, right? Where I'm in there trying to, convert everyone. But it's surprising how many people, through their own process of engaging the things that are assigned, you know, come to see that this is an ideal that they should be trying to get closer to. And so I think it's the fact that I make a concerted effort not to badger anyone into it, and that still a very high percentage of people come away right after their own process of discernment with some sort of a commitment to move in this general direction. I think makes it even more exciting, right? Because if you get someone up there at a podium browbeating people,
Right.
they're going to have 70% of them are going to say, absolutely. And then the minute they get out of the classroom, they're going to stop thinking about it, right? Because people may not remember what you say, but they'll remember how you made them feel, right? And so if you come from on high in the classroom, it's a great way to stymie people's learning process. So what I always try to do is create an invitational space where people can take an honest look at issues and then bring those issues into concert with these other aspects of their life. And yeah, I mean, just today I made a post on LinkedIn and on my Facebook authors page about an article that I co-wrote with a student who took my very first animal ethics class 20 years ago. Her name is Sarah Bodbile Rules, and she is now the Associate Dean for Graduate Research at the Van Andel Institute in Grand Rapids. So now very much my peer, and if titles are concerned, my superior, right? She's an Associate Dean. And we decided, when the book was under construction, I thought, gosh, I wonder what Sarah would think, because our journeys have unfolded in these really interesting ways, differently, but also parallel in some ways. And she and her husband, Steve, are both field biologists. He's a bird specialist. And they've been all over the world researching animals. They do equine rescue. So they have a donkey that lives with them. And we just did an article for my university's alumni magazine where each of us wrote from our own perspective about how the other challenged us, right, in our journeys in going vegan. And so that, I think, that has been one of the biggest joys for me as a teacher, is seeing my students make a commitment to living in a way that brings them joy, even as it repairs and heals the world. And that really, right, is one of the most beautiful gifts that you can help
Absolutely.
someone to find, right, is something that does that inside outside trick, right? Because so often, if you want to be happy on the inside, things won't fit on the outside. Or if you want things to go well outside, you got to make all these internal sacrifices. Right. And the beautiful thing about going vegan is the way that it brings those two things together, right? It gives us all this energy to then go out into the world and do this work of renewal, right, on all these fronts simultaneously. And so I have seen, many students. I've lost count. I'm old now. Right? I've been doing this for 25 years.
You're a young buck compared to me. Trust me.
But yeah, I mean, it's been amazing. I mean, just a couple of stories, if you'll indulge me, Kathleen. So one of my favorite stories from this year, reconnecting with students at the 20-year mark, has been really exciting. And one of my students, Noah Promsma, is now a nutrition education coordinator at, you might have heard of, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. So Neil
I know quite a few
yeah.
people there. And if you haven't met Chuck Carroll, I need to introduce you to him.
Absolutely. Yeah, please do. But you'll love this. So for the 20th anniversary of the course, he came in from Washington, D.C. and taught the nutrition component, my student from all these years ago.
That's awesome.
And he also wrote the appendix in Hungry Beautiful Animals that's on plant-based nutrition and health. So, I've been collaborating with students, learning together with students for 20 years and seeing the fruits of their work in the world. Honestly, I'm more excited about that than anything I've done, right, because that exponential multiplier, right? Of seeing people find joy with these decisions and then going out and sharing that, right, with other people in a way that leavens the world. Honestly, that's my favorite part of this work, and that's what inspired me to write the book, right? Is this seeing how this joy aggregation has happened time and time again for students who come in thinking, what's this weird diet thing, who
Right.
would take this seriously, and then in a period of just a few short weeks or months connecting all the dots and not feeling obligated to do something, but seeing the opportunity here, right? And that's such a shift, right? That pivot from a defensive feeling like, ugh, I'm obligated,
Right.
right, to this sort of open, wonderful, inspiring feeling of there are these opportunities here. And the more I lean into this, the more joy I experience. Right. It's just such a, it's a much more sustainable way to live toward this, right? Than to
It
let the
really is.
anger and the suffering and the exclusion just eat away. And don't get me wrong, in the early years of my journey, there was a lot of that scarcity, right? And I
Right.
I
Right.
write about that in the book about how compassion fatigue is real. I mean, if you're doing rescues, when you deeply, um, you know, when you bring animals into your life and you deeply invest in their well-being, you find out what amazing creatures they are. And then you realize, holy smokes, we are creating lives and deaths of abject misery
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
80 billion creatures just like this one snoring in my bed, right?
Right. Right.
That
Absolutely.
can feel debilitating, overwhelming, right? It sucks your energy. And for me anyway, I mean, there were times when I feel like here's a nice big vocabulary word, turn me into a misanthrope, right? Somebody who hates fellow human beings, right? Somebody who's so frustrated
Right.
with the way fellow human beings, including myself for 30 years, right? Let's be honest. It's not like I lived an enlightened vegan life, for the whole journey. Um, and so, yeah, this pivot from scarcity to abundance is really what has changed the game for me
Absolutely.
and for a lot of my students, is to say, yeah, we are against suffering, but it's only because we're for flourishing,
Right.
right?
Well,
It's for flourishing first. And then because of that, we're against suffering.
And I really love how you showcased your students and because I think one thing that is so important for us to do is not to worry about who gets the credit. When I was out doing a lot of keynote speaking, writing a lot of books, and it was all about business, and it was like, look at me, look at me, look at me, and now it's like, hey, I'll step back, and it's like, if I have to do it behind the scenes, I'll do it behind the scenes. And I actually had somebody who wanted to come and see our sanctuary, and I said, "Oh, it's our private. This is our home, and
Mm-hmm.
we are self-funded. We don't get any donations." And there are times we had a situation with one of our horses recently who has Cushing's disease, an older horse, and it was a substantial investment to make sure she was well taken care of. And those are things that we just do because we do it. It's not so that we get credit for anything. And I think that's where we really will move forward, is when everybody is equally applauded, if you will, by each other, of like, yeah, great job, keep doing it. And there is such a thing as compassion fatigue. When you go out on a lot of animal rescues and you see how people treat animals, it's just like, how
Mm.
and so I love that you're approaching it from a positive perspective. And Matt, how do people reach you? What's the best URL? And then let's talk about where people can find your book.
Yeah, great. So hungrybeautifulanimals.com. That weird philosophical title was strange enough that I got the .com, Kathleen. So hungrybeautifulanimals.com. And we've got a lot of stuff up there for people to look at, from resources to, more about the book, to some of the other podcasts and things that I've done. I've looked forward to having this one on there as well. They can also find me on LinkedIn, Matthew Halteman, and I have a Facebook author page, Matthew C. Halteman. And when it comes to getting the book, yeah, if you go to the website, hungrybeautifulanimals.com, we have a portal there where you can choose, right? Some people are Amazon people, some people are indie bookshop people, some people want to get it used, right? There's a portal there where through
Excellent.
Hachette, my publisher, where you can find all those different conduits and choose the one that works for you.
I love it. I love it. So, Matt, this has been truly, truly delightful. I love what you're doing. And your final thoughts for people as you leave them with something that's actionable for them. What can people do, regardless of whether they're vegan or not, but to really look at the animals as sentient beings and that they do have feelings? And you mentioned something before you answered the question. You did mention something about the people that work in factory farms. Oftentimes they're as much the victims as the animals. When we see the videos, we see the people that are torturing the animals, and they're getting great glee out of being very sadistic. Not everybody that works there is that way. There are
Absolutely
some that are
not.
truly victims. That's the only way they're going to feed their family. They might be here illegally. That's a whole nother conversation. And so I think it's having compassion all the way around and finding solutions so that we don't have to live like this. So what are your final thoughts for people?
Yeah, so I would just say be kind to yourself and be curious about your inner complexities, right? Because what I've found is finding courage to do new things is ultimately about knowing yourself, right? Figuring out, okay, what is intellectually exciting to me? What are my emotional triggers? Who are my friends and what challenges will I face if I try to make changes? What is my physical body like? What are my likes and dislikes? How do I think about this from a perspective of creating joy, right? Rather than experiencing scarcity. And so, what I often tell people is, you know, Rome wasn't built in a day. And sometimes the best way to set yourself up for a sustainable journey, right, into this consciousness expanding, body building, beauty drenched way of life is to start with an inner soil amendment. And what I mean by that is look at the different parts of who you are and kind of stir things up a little bit. Say to yourself, okay, how do I get my intellectual curiosity stimulated around animal stuff? What's a great book that I could read to get me thinking in ways that I haven't thought before? Socially, what's something I could do that would really show me the possibilities for living in this way? Maybe I go to a vegan meetup, or maybe I go to a talk where I might meet some other people who think this way. Emotionally, right? Where are my thresholds of tolerance? Do I really want to watch the suffering videos? Or might it be better for me to look at Isa Leshko's portraits of sanctuary animals in their old age, right? Allowed to Grow Old, one of the most beautiful books that I've ever seen by an amazing activist photographer. And I feel like I learned more about farm animals from looking at the panels of that book and seeing the wisdom of those creatures than I learned from hundreds of hours of suffering footage, right? Where it's
Right.
so easy to lose the individuals for the abjection, right? And so what all of these suggestions have in common is that they focus your inner attention on what you need to thrive, so that when you go out there into the world and start to make changes, you know yourself well enough not to be rattled, right, by those different challenges that you'll face. And so in the same way, I use the metaphor of an inner soil amendment because, you know, if soil is dead, nothing will grow in it, right? So if you put seeds in dead soil, you're going to have a really hard time getting any sort of harvest. But if you've got a beautiful, rich, organic soil, right, and you put seeds in it, the seeds are going to bear tremendous fruit. And our inner joy is the soil from which everything else in our life grows, right? And so unless we have that rich inner ferment, unless we're getting to know who we are intellectually, emotionally, socially, physically, morally, it's going to be very hard for these seeds to take root and really push us in the direction of sustainable changes. So I think the more people are willing to get intimate with who they are on the inside, to turn that inner soil, to figure out what they love, to figure out what inspires them, to figure out what brings them joy, and then lock into that mission, right, for going vegan out there in the world. Maybe you're someone who's going to rescue animals. Maybe you're someone who's going to integrate these messages into your teaching as a kindergarten teacher, as a sixth grade teacher, as a college professor. Maybe you're somebody who's going to bring a dazzling casserole to the potluck that vanishes first, even though it's vegan. Right? Maybe you're going to be the person who decides that your business is going to do fundraisers for sanctuaries or earth-friendly nonprofit organizations, right? I mean, once you know who you are, it's so much easier to find what your calling is to transform the world, and what's the unique thing that you can do that you love doing that nobody else is as well suited as you are to do. And I think when people get a taste of what it's like for that inner joy to meet the world in its need, it's like going in for a second bite of tiramisu. There's no obligation at all, right? Because desire is doing all the work. You do not have to get motivated to eat another bite of your favorite dessert. And if you do that inner assessment of what you love, what brings you joy, and you take that out into the world, it can feel effortless to move in the direction of what's beautiful for everyone. And so that wasn't really a last word. That was like a last 10 paragraphs.
I love your passion because, as you were talking, I was thinking, yeah, I could do that. No, I could do that. And I do podcasting and I work with businesses that are vegan-based businesses. And I write a lot of blog posts and articles and that's my passion. And I rescue. But, I was thinking, wow, you're giving people so many options and so many choices. And Matt, this has truly been delightful. I've been talking with Matt Halteman, and Matt is an author. He's a vegan. He's a professor. He's a philosopher. He's a husband. And he's just a really heck of a nice guy who's very passionate about what he's doing. And again, I want to thank you, Matt. And I encourage people to go to your website. We'll put that in the show notes. And for everybody who's been listening and watching, please leave a rating and review of the show. It'll help with the algorithm so that we can reach more people with this message. And I encourage you to listen to this episode a few times because there's so many gems in here and so many little bites of knowledge of how you can actually have an impact in a very positive way, because right now people are very disconnected from what they're doing. It's like they're on their devices and they're so disconnected from the reality of the pain and suffering that goes on, and you can be a part of the solution, the love and the healing that goes on with the animals. I'm Kathleen Gage, the host of Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show, encouraging you, go out, do the right thing. Have a great day.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. It's been a joy.
Thank you. You've been listening to the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show. I'm your host, Kathleen Gage, inviting you to subscribe to this channel wherever you're listening or watching the show. And please let your friends know about the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show. Live healthy.